So we can start the session.
Yeah.
Okay. So good evening, everyone, or good afternoon from France. I hope you are doing well. We have today a new session of that course on mergers and acquisition, which is session number 7. Yesterday we had session 6, and tomorrow it will be session 8, and Saturday session 9. Okay. So first, remember what we did yesterday. We went again through Nabisco case, which is probably one of the best cases I know for negotiated offers, and where you see how financial management team work during that kind of negotiation. You understand what are the criteria. You understand for this case also what are the different steps of this organization, how you should be prepared. What was important yesterday and what we did was really these slides 25.1, 25.2, 25.3, how to be prepared, how to manage the negotiation, and what to do after the contract is signed. It was also summarized in the BSN Dun & Nabisco 4 slides in another presentation. And after dealing with a few technical questions on goodwill and also valuation of the different companies bought at the same time in the deal, we had a look to the structure, complex structure on the deal with the holding companies, different kind of holding companies and operational companies. And then we moved to another case, which is the Perrier case, which is a very complex case, in fact, with 2 companies listed, Exor and Source Perrier, one of them being a holding company, second one being an operational company, but also a mother with subsidiaries in water supply and also in cheese. Second, we understood that it was at the beginning a family-owned firm, 100% created by a man, Mr. Mentsolopoulos. And this company at the beginning was Exor, with another name anyway, and was specialized in developing a network of small supermarkets. It was restructured 30 years after, with all the assets one after the other were sold, and Exor became a holding company with cash inside, and they decided to diversify in other businesses their activities, their operations, and they invested in wine, Chateau Margaux, Bordeaux. They invested in real estate, mainly offices, warehouses, logistics premises, but also bought a stake of Source Perrier, minority stake of Source Perrier. They also designed new equity issues, and part of them, of the shares were bought by eFint, which is a holding company, which is the holding company based in Luxembourg for fiscal reason, which is a kind of tool of the Fiat Anelli group, which is very well known for cars and lorries, into geographical, but also economic sectors diversification. So at a point in time, Mr. Mentsolopoulos wanted to sell, wanted to make an arbitrage, I would say, selling more shares of Exor. eFint, the Anelli group, was interested, you know, and we agreed on the fact if it could launch a friendly offer on 100% of the shares of Exor. But we have two other players there first. The first one is a group which is quite large, about 30% of public investors, individuals, but also firms connected with banks, Société Générale and Crédit Agricole. And on the other side, you know, Mr. Mintzilopoulos was very old a few months after he passed away, and his daughter, who was already managing the Bordeaux wine and Chateau Margaux, was interested in keeping only the Bordeaux wine and to sell all the other elements. So, you know, it's a very complex situation. So first we had a friendly offer, which is the first one in my table here. We had the first offer of eFint on 100% of a share. You can qualify this offer partly friendly and partly hostile, but because it is friendly, of course, on Mintzilopoulos 40%, but it is not friendly, it's hostile for the other investor, about 30% in total. So immediately there was a reaction from the two main producers of sparkling and non-sparkling water on the European market, Nestlé and Danone, and they decided, you know, both of them decided to launch takeover bids on Exor and Sources Perrier. And if you remember, I make comments on the table you see on the slide here. And on January 20th, February 21st, 26th, and you had three other takeover bids, which were in fact hostile takeover bid on Exor and Sources Perrier, which means at the end, after four takeover bids, you have two takeover bids on Exor, two takeover bids on Sources Perrier, which is quite unusual. And the differences are for one of them, V1 on Exor's on the price, but for the second company, for Perrier, the difference is on the minimum of 50%, which is in the first operation on January 20th and not in the second one. So you have four different offers, and the situation becomes very complex. We don't know what will happen, and generally in that case, we need some kind of arbitrage at the end. And the arbitrage will be done by the courts, the judges, because several shareholders went to the judges and to the courts and asked for a ruling, because there's a question on the possibility for the company to use, the rights of votes in the hands of their own subsidiaries. Okay, so 13.8% here. The second point, which was raised, was on the communication made by the potential buyer of Sources Perrier, which is Exor. Now, you see 35%, there's a question mark here. And the problem is on what did they do? It seems they traded very often on this share on the market, and they didn't make the wild announcement to the market authorities and to the potential investors. So these issues were analyzed by the courts, and the courts decided, first to give new and very clear definition of these two questions. They said clearly the shares of a mother in the hands of a subsidiary cannot exercise their right to vote. They can get dividends, they can use the ownership, but they cannot use right to vote. And second, the court asked for a study on the trading position of Exor on the share of Source Perrier, and it was demonstrated that they sold and bought many shares in different periods of time without making the correct announcement. So the decision was very clear and accelerated the arbitrage. In fact, it was that the 35% rights of votes here were reduced to 22 and the 13 just disappeared. It means instead of having 48.8% in Source Perrier, Exor had only 22%. Means the battlefield is completely different. And the consequence of that is that it was decided by all the parties, to negotiate. And the result of the negotiation, that's what I explained last session, means yesterday at the end of the session, excuse me, the result of the negotiation was that EFINT will obtain 100% of the shares of Exor. It means, in fact, the different funds and individual investors will receive a compensation through another friendly takeover bid. And of course, the Menzelopoulos family, Mrs. Menzelopoulos, the daughter, will sell its share, 40%, to EFINT. And EFINT and Fiat Group will become the only shareholder of Exor. And Exor will keep only the real estate. That means if you analyze the position of the Fiat Group, they were interested in this operation to diversify their activities from the car industry into the food industry and the beverage industry. And at the end, they got a holding company with assets in real estate, in offices, warehouses, and logistic premises. Okay. Second, Mrs. Menzelopoulos got 100% of Chateau Margaux and other vineyards in Bordeaux, in the Bordeaux area, and cash compensation also. So the link between Exor and Chateau Margaux was definitely cut. Source Perrier was brought to Nestlé, and Nestlé will launch a friendly takeover bid to buy all shares, 100% of the shares. But anyway, Source Perrier, as we know, had different subsidiaries in the water supply. Of course, the Source Perrier Spring, Source Perrier first, with market share. This is quite important in Europe and in the US. They got also two other non-sparkling production of non-sparkling water with a dimension, with a capacity of production large enough to satisfy the demand on the European market. And they had also 25 small springs, which are regional Springs, plus the ownership of Cap de Roquefort, which is a well-known cheese in France, but also in Western Europe. So it was decided that Nestlé will get the Source Supérieure itself, all the other springs, but we'll have to resell Volvic, number one in Europe in terms of production capacity, to Danone, and the cheese to Crédit Agricole, which is a bank, bank of a farmer. We'll see that later in that session, which is supposed either to keep it, or to find a new potential buyer for this, for managing this production. So we agreed on that. We agreed. Everyone signed. The Menzelobos family, the Italian group, Mrs. Menzelobos, of course, Nestlé, Danone, the largest investment fund invested in Exor and in Source Perrier also. Everyone agreed. So to manage that, it was necessary to launch two other takeover bids. It means all the preceding takeover bids, December the 5th, January the 20th, February 21st, February 26th, were cancelled after the agreement. And it was decided jointly, to launch two takeover bids, organized to obtain, to buy the shares in the hands of different investors. Two companies are listed on the market, so you find individual investors, for example. So they increased significantly the level of the price. As you see for Perrier, the increase is from 1,475 to 1,700. And for Exor, it's a bit more limited, but also the constraint on the 50% disappeared. So these two operations were organized in such a way that they were a success. So it means that at the end of the process, the control of these two firms, Exor and Source Perrier, were in the hands, of the final buyers. After that, they had to allocate, of course, part of the assets. For example, Nestlé had to sell part of the subsidiaries of Source Perrier, Volvic to Danone, and Cap de Roquefort to Crédit Agricole. So this is a long operation in terms of timing. It's difficult in terms of law regulation, but it was accepted by the national regulators, where the companies were settled, mainly France, Italy, and Switzerland. And it seems that after 2 or 3 months, all the consequences of the operation will be over. So that's what I'm trying to explain yesterday. Now, this is a very complex operation. It is of interest here because you don't have very often two companies listed on the market, one of them being a holding company, the second one is subsidiary, which is also a mother of other subsidiaries, which are submitted to takeover bids. Second, we had 4 takeover bids, 3 of them being hostile, one of them being more majority friendly, It's in fact on the border. Third, it's an example of complex operation which is not easy to manage up to the end. Success of a seller only on the market, on stock market. And fourth, there is an arbitrage which is needed, and the arbitrage, because of these questions of subsidiaries, voting rights, and also rules of communication, and when a company is trading shares on the market, this arbitrage was made here by the court, by the French courts. Okay. And last, after the arbitrage, we had a negotiation, and the negotiation consequences were a split of this group into pieces. It's a split, allocation of assets to different players, and it is organized first around the cancellation of the 4 preceding offers and 2 new friendly offers which were launched, to catch, to buy nearly the highest percentage possible of shares of the 2 companies. That's where we are. It seems, and make the summary, this presentation, that the operation is over now, and that each of the buyer, if Fiat and Mili Group first, Nestlé, Danone, Mrs. Gvenselopoulos, and the Crédit Agricole, will have now only questions of management, integration in their own business, assets obtained or bought. This is what we are. The last point here of it is what about the Brussels? What about the European Union department? They were not part of this operation up to that point. But the rule, if you remember, in presentation of concentration, are such that if you are in an international operation, and it is clearly international here because Nestlé is Swiss, if it is Luxembourgese and the main shareholders are Italian, and most of the other players and the assets themselves are in France. So it's really a European and complex European deal. And also because of the size, if you have a look to the amount involved, the amount of payment, valuation, but also the amount of sales, level of sales. If you have a look to European rules, they should be analyzed by the unit working on concentration, cartels, and so on in Brussels. It's the famous department number 5. So just after the signature and the launching of the 2 offers, last 2 takeover bids, the Brussels authority asked explanations to the different players, all those, obtaining assets, particularly, of course, Nestlé, Danone, and the Fiat and Mili Group. That's what happened. So what's happened? Something which is quite interesting is to have a look to the table I present here. To this table. The first analysis of this authority is in market share. And on this table, you find 2 geographical zones. The first one is France, And the second one is Europe, the European Union, as it was, of course, at the time in 1993. It is much smaller than it is right now. We were about 12, 13 countries, not 27 or 28. No. But anyway, if you have a look, the size in terms of economic strength, economic power of this group at the time was about 80% of what it is right now, because the new countries are not as powerful on an economic point of view, and with a demography which is less important than the Western countries. So you have to simple statistic table, here, one for France and the second one for Europe. So their market share. Let's have a look to Europe first. And there was a calculation made by the analysts of the Brussels authorities on the market share of different players, BSN, Perrier, and Nestlé, on water supply, before the takeover bid. Now you see BSN 16, Perrier 16 to 17, it wasn't very clear, and Nestlé only 6%. One of the key points in the discussion after that is that what kind of product are taken into account? Everybody agreed we should not take into account the cheese, it's something different. But the question is here, do we have to measure the market shares, on the sparkling water or on sparkling plus non-sparkling water together? And do we have to take into account only the water, sparkling or non-sparkling, sold in bottles, or in other kind of container? So the answer of Brussels was water is water, even if it is sparkling or not sparkling, but we take into account only those sold in bottles no more than 1.5 liter. It means for the small bottles of 25 centiliters to the bottles of 1.5 liters. All the other all the other containers are supposed to be another market, because generally, they are bought only by restaurants or hotels. So it was a discussion there. Of course, the advisor of BSN and Nestlé said sparkling water is very different from non-sparkling water. The customers are not the same. It's very segmented and so on. Okay. So there was another issue there. But anyway, it was not very important, because with 16, 17 or 6%, no one can say there is a dominating position, there is a monopoly, so there was no problem according to the European regulation. Following column on the right, after the takeover bids and the divestiture in Volvic, you have a takeover bids, the two friendly takeover bid, and after that, Nestlé bought Source Perrier, and Source Perrier was split into 3 pieces, in fact. The largest one kept by Nestlé. Volvic sold to Danone, and last, the cheese sold to Crédit Agricole. And they measured the market shares of BSN and Nestlé at the time on the European market. You see that the fact BSN obtained Volvic has for result an increase of its market share from 16 to 19%. But for Nestlé, it was a complete change, from 6 to 19 or 20%, with Source Perrier, a bottle, sparkling water, but with Contract Civil also and the 25 small springs, regional springs. So anyway, the problem there is that the competition has been reduced mainly because one of the players disappeared, Perrier, Source Perrier. We have two large dominant players, but they get only 19-20% each, and all the others, which are not they're not being calculated there. There is no one more with more than 3% of market share. So the European institutions accepted this position, which seems to be dominant, but not really dominant. Competition is quite large. It means that you have 60% of the market share, which are split between a large number of small or medium-sized producers. So the question is not there, the question is mainly in France. So you move to the left side of the table here, and you see that before the takeover bid, if you make the same analysis with the segmentation of the products, before the takeover bid, we had market shares, dominant market shares, number one market share for Source Perrier, 33%, and of course, 33% of Source Perrier disappeared afterwards because Perrier was split. BSN in France had about 18%, was the number one of the market after Source Perrier, and moved up to 29 in the position of number two in the country, with the inclusion in its portfolio of Volvic. So Volvic brings 3% to BSN on the European battlefield and 11% on the French one. And Nestlé moved from 15 to 37% with the other springs, which are in Source Perrier's, Perrier bottles, of course, but also Constructiville and the regional springs. And we still have here a large percentage of small players, 1%, 2%, 3% of the market, no more. So a large number of small competitors. Generally, most of them are regional competitors. They don't sell outside the country. But in total, they got more than 1/3. It's about 34%. So the situation is there. And the European authorities said, we don't like this. We think that BSN plus Nestlé, that's too much. The total market share here is around 2/3 of the market for both of them. And they also said, it seems that along, the different financial operations, the 6 takeover bids, Nestlé and Danone had the same interest and had discussion together and agreed on launching separately, but sharing the market, in fact, takeover bids on the two companies. Nestlé launching takeover bids on Source Perrier and BSN launching takeover bids on Exor. So they acted after agreeing on their strategy, and since the beginning of the battle, they already agreed on what will happen. It means how the split will be organized, after the different arbitrage, negotiations, and takeover bids. So this is in contradiction, with the European laws. You should not agree before or in the middle of an operation without giving the information to the other competitors into the market. And at the end also, they said these 37 plus 29 should be considered jointly because it is a result of a common financial and strategic operation, in fact. That means you find what we call in economy a duopoly. It means an alliance of two companies which agreed on their strategy. That means, in fact, we have here a dominant position of the market of 66% managed jointly by BSN and Nestle. Of course, you understand what the lawyers Nestle and BSN, Danone said, no, this is not true. We were competitors. We never agreed. You don't have a proof, and so on. But at the end, the decision is in the hands of Brussels. And Brussels said, no, we don't agree. You cannot do that. So you understand the situation. You went through the operations. We had the arbitrage. We had the negotiations. We have a cancellation of forced offers. They launched 2 friendly offers. They bought the largest part of the share, and they started allocating the different assets. And at the point in time, in the middle of this allocation integration process, the Brussels authority said, no, this is not possible because for 2 reasons, this agreement you had together and also this final position, which is duopoly, dominating the market and limiting the competition level, we don't agree about that. So that's really the power of the regional authority, which is the same case in the US. So when you go through battles, negotiations, arbitrage processes, and at the end allocation of assets, you have to be very careful of what's happened. You need a lawyer with you, good lawyer, some good knowledge of the regulations. And an operation like this one can be accepted by the national authority. Had no problem with French authority. They had no problem with the Italians, the Swiss, and the Luxembourgese, regulations authorities, but they had a problem with the European one. If you remember my presentation on concentrations and cartels in Europe, you understand also we are at the point, nearly middle of the 90s, where the power of the European authorities was the most important one. After that, remember we had these 2 decisions by the European Court on Schneider Legrand and Tetra Laval Sidel, which wrote a new policy, in fact, with more power to what we call subsidiarity. It means giving more power to national or even local authorities compared to the European one. So the balance was in favor of Brussels at that point. After that, the balance moved the other way around. It doesn't mean that Brussels lost its authority, but that to be more careful in analyzing, explaining, their decision. So it was like, what's happened now? The regulators, they have, in fact, very powerful national or European or American. It means when they say no, it's no. You have, as the position of BSN and Nestle, the only things you can do is first to negotiate. And second, if you don't agree after the negotiation, or the results of the negotiation, is to go to the court. That's what happened with Legrand, Schneider, and Tetra Laval Sidel. So here they tried to have a negotiation. They didn't go to the court, and they get at the end a kind of agreement with the European authority, which was not very favorable to their position, but which allowed to integrate the largest part of the company and to manage these companies. What was it? It was no problem for the Italian group. They will keep the ownership of Exor and of the real estate. No problem for Mrs. Mantzouloupoulou. She will keep, the wine of Bordeaux with Chateau Margaux and the cash she invested with the other players. No problem with Danone. They will keep, Volvic. Fine. So the problem was in fact for Nestlé, and what the European authorities wanted is to reduce the 37% market share you find in France after the deal, the end of the deal, and to reduce to something smaller. It was not clear how much it should be, but smaller. And after a month of negotiation, it took another 5 months of negotiation between Brussels and Nestlé mainly. They agreed on the fact that Nestlé will resell not only Volvic, not only Cave de Roquefort from Source Perrier, but also they had to resell another spring, which is Vichy, and kind of hotels and buildings dedicated to tourism. And they had also to resell the 25 regional springs. And the most difficult point at that stage is to find a buyer. How to find a buyer? And the buyer which will be accepted by both parties. It means by the European Union on one side and by Nestlé and Danone, the competitors on the other side. And it took months, about 5 months before we found a medium-sized firms, many involved in wine production and distribution, many in Bordeaux area also, and in the beer market. And this is a group called Castel, and Castel bought, from Nestlé, the 25 local springs plus Vichy tourism and spring. So that's the end of the process, So I thought this case was of interest because we have at the same time hostile and friendly offers. We have several offers. We have an arbitrage. We have an agreement which is not accepted by the European Union regulator, and after that we had a negotiation and a new split of Source Perrier, Nestlé being obliged, to sell other springs than Volvic and other assets than the cheese assets. So this is what I wanted to show you, and this is for this Perrier case, which was the first part of the presentation today. We start now with something which is completely different. We have been through many operations, hostile, friendly, rather simple, much more difficult. We try to analyze technical problems, also negotiation questions, and now we move, and we find again some of these points. We move from this very large industry, about beverage, about food here mainly, to the banking sector. And what I will do now with you is moving to the banking sector. We will start we start here on a presentation of the problems we find. On the problem we find. So you should see, I hope it is true, should see a slide called Banks in Europe. It is presentation number 32, 3 and 2, Banks in Europe Environment. If you don't see Banks in Europe Environment, just say I don't see, because I'm not very confident in Zoom. This is not the best software to teach. We have much better software, but it seems we are not allowed in Vietnam, so I don't know why. So Banks in Europe Environment. So what to do? What is my goal here? I will first raise a few questions with very limited number of slides. I've got 3 slides on here on the banking sector in Europe and trying to understand what is the situation, what are the problems, what is our potential scenarios here also, and why this situation probably involves in the future new operations in terms of acquisition, merger, joint venture, splits, alliances. Second, we will, through another set of slides, very short also, which is presentation 53, make a short presentation, a very short presentation, an explanation why to choose cases to try to illustrate the situation. This time it will be, of course, past cases, there are other, and I will use 4 of them, and we explain some in a few minutes what are the cases I choose, which are very different. You will find this case and this case and the same time classical acquisition with negotiated offer. You will find complex battles with an arbitrage at the end, not by the courts here, but by the governor of the central bank. You will find also an international acquisition. HSBC will be involved. You will find also an acquisition, and this is one of the interesting point. When you study, acquisition made 10 or 15 years ago, and have a look at what's happened to now, you understand in several cases, and this is the case of HSBC in Europe, that the strategy moved completely. It's completely today the opposite of what it was at the time of the acquisition. I will go through, and you can try to understand and to explain that. We will have also a case on an acquisition and a complete merger of 2 banks, one being that's on the agricultural bank, the second one an industrial bank, having 2 legal formats, and we will explain why after making the operation, we decided not to merge completely, but to merge partially. Okay. And last, I have a case which is a European case, mainly Dutch, Belgian, British, and Spanish, which is on a takeover bid, hostile takeover bid against a friendly takeover bid, organized by what we call a consortium. It means this is one of the most interesting cases of consortium. Consortium is nothing, It just you get 3 CEOs of 3 different banks, and they say, okay, let's have a lunch together. And at the end of the lunch, you say, okay, we have found a target, and we launch together, a common hostile offer. And if we succeed, we will just split the target into pieces, into 3 different pieces, and each of us will integrate in its business, the part of the target. So, that's what I will do. So let's start by the beginning. Banks in Europe, what is the environment today, and why we have that kind of operation, and why you probably in the future we get more financial and strategic operation based on acquisitions and mergers. So the first part, and you can have a look to what's happened in Asia right now. Also, generally our comparison in Europe, when you compare Europe to someone else, it's to the US or North America. And we understand very quickly that we have too many banks and financial institutions in Europe, even if the number has already been reduced. For example, in countries like France and Germany, it has been divided by 4 in 20 years. So concentration has been operating, reduction and of the numbers of the players, and of course of the average size of the players, whatever the criteria you use. Not too many banks, financial institutions, and they are still too national. It means we have one currency, as you know, at least for the largest part of the country, 17 countries today, and the banks are still mainly national. There's a kind of contradiction there. How can you manage a banking market which is partly national, partly European, with a currency system, a central bank, which is at the European level? And what about the other countries? I mean, we are 27 in the European Union, 17 countries are in the Eurozone. We have 10 countries outside. How to manage that? So we have to clarify, we have to simplify. We have too many banks, too many financial institutions, even we have already started concentrations for years. More concentration is needed, and of course, if more concentration is needed, that means that you will see agreements through joint ventures. We will see acquisitions, total mergers, partial mergers, split also. Remember that also banks are under the control of 3 different institutions. The first one being, of course, and everyone think probably to this control today, the central bank, the European Central Bank, based in Frankfurt in Germany, which means today that in fact, if you consider the market, the national banks like the Bank of France, Bank of Italy, Bank of Germany, and so on, they are kind of subsidiaries of the central bank. It's also partly managed by the EU, the institution itself, but also by the national government. So it's a bit complex, and that means decisions are made on not made quickly enough in many cases when you have a crisis, for example. So this is a system which has to be simplified, and also the policy has to be clarified, because of course national governments, EU and the ECB don't have exactly the same position of the future of the banking market integration. Third, returns are decreasing. If you have a look to the return on equity of the banks, before the 2007-2008 crisis and the today return, it has been divided by two. In average, we had about 16% before, and we have something around 8. And around 8, this is a problem because for many banks, it's under their weighted average cost of capital. So that means if you are in that kind of situation, one way to re-establish one part of the way, part of the measures to re-establish a better return, it's to organize mergers in order to catch economies of scale. Add to this that constraints has been tighter for the last 12 years, with more constraints on the ratios to follow, which is kind of consequence of all the negotiations and new rules coming from Basel 1, 2, 3, and probably more in the future. So these constraints are also more simple to reach when you are a larger bank. So the model, of if you have a look to the model of the two probably most successful banks at the moment in Europe, which are BNP Paribas, the French one, and sometimes the Spanish one, they are generalist banks. They are on all the segments on the markets. The fourth point, is number 4, sorry for that, is that competition level is increasing. And this is true in every country. You know that in Vietnam also, fintechs are coming. So we don't know if fintechs are really competitors or if they bring something, some kind of innovation, and that one by integrated by the banks or insurance companies. We have also what called the GAFAM, like Apple or some others, Microsoft. And we have also the competition of the non-EU banks, and the potential competition of the non-EU banks in Europe is mainly from the American banks, because the American banks, the US banks at least, are much more concentrated. And if you have a look to the market value of Wells Fargo, for example, on the US market, and compared to BNP Paribas, the number one in Europe, it's 1 to 4. It means Wells Fargo value is 4 times the value of BNP Paribas. So there is clearly a risk for the European banking system. What to do? Part of the answer is probably in concentrations. Second point. So we have a few management trends. Banks are more and more diversifying. That's what I try to explain here. Specialists, because we had banks specialized in international trade, in real estate, for example. Progressively, we are integrated into generalist diversified banks. You will see with the example of BNP Paribas, that's what they have done. They have diversified their positions, not only in terms of geography, in terms of countries, trying to become a European player, but also in terms of segments of the banking activity. And it seems that it is the most successful way to do that. Even if you have a look to Goldman Sachs, they are extending their activities in segments they didn't have experience at all 5 years ago. Banks acquire fintechs, brokers, and real estate companies. For brokers, it's already done. Largest parts of the brokers in the stock market have the stake of their equity in the hands of insurance company or banks. 20 years ago, brokers were independent companies And on many stock market, it was they were under a regulation which specified that they had to be independent in order to be allowed to trade on the market. These regulations have been cancelled, eliminated, and the consequence is that brokers are really subsidiaries today of large banks and large insurance companies. The second element also is that real estate, and real estate company or real estate banks were completely independent 20 years ago also from the classical generalist banks. We had specific banks in Europe, in all the countries, dedicated to real estate operation. All these banks were bought, integrated, merged with a large diversified bank. And now this is the problem of fintechs coming in, and I will show you some of this evolution on BNP Paribas. At the beginning, it seemed that fintechs were competitors, and that perhaps they will obtain market shares and get value created by development of operations like payments, simply, and be more competitive than the large bank. And what we see progressively is that first they sign contract, create joint ventures with traditional banks, joint ventures. The next step is that banks take insurance companies also minority stake in the equity of fintechs because they need more equity loans to develop their activities, their operations, and they don't find easily these amounts. And third, that some of them are completely 100% integrated. You will see Nickel company, for example, from BNP Paribas, into the large banks. Now, it seems a bit like the evolution you will see during one of the next sessions in the pharmaceutical sector with biotechnology companies. What is the future of biotechnology for companies? First they are innovative, they are startup, they are completely research oriented. You see that with the vaccine today, Pfizer and BioNTech, that is typical case. After that, they signed the first agreement with a large pharmaceutical group, and then the pharmaceutical group takes a minority stake into the biotechnology company, and one day they integrate the company. We see exactly the same evolution in for fintechs in means of payments mainly, but also in real estate, but also in portfolio management, for example. Third, we have a problem of insurance. If you have a look to what's happened 20 or 30 years ago, we already had relations between bank and insurance company, bank, what we call bank insurance or insurance banks. And in many cases, insurance companies, both banks, or had large stakes in banks. If I look to what is the situation today, the situation is not the same anymore. Banks are dominating the relation. And we have three kinds of relations between banks and insurance company or insurance. The first one, and you see that with Crédit Agricole, Crédit Lyonnais, some banks has decided to create, scratch their own company from nothing. They started from zero. And Crédit Agricole created two insurance companies, the first one from the life insurance and the second one from non-life insurance. Some other players, like BNP Paribas, we see that with BNP Paribas, have developed a long-term relation the largest insurance company in France, which is AXA, which is number 2 in Europe. And they still have this relation, okay? But at the same time, when insurance was more and more integrated into the banking operation, they have decided to create also their own insurance company. And at the same time, they have this agreement, contract, and joint venture with AXA and an insurance company, mainly on life insurance. And you have a third situation also. And the third situation of bank and insurance is, for example, the case of the post office. Post office was created to deliver letters at the beginning, and after that they moved to packaging. They moved also to telephone, and after that they split the telephone, and they developed financial services. But financial services were very simple at the beginning, and they were progressively more sophisticated. Some of the post office make sophistication of services in delivery. For example, Dutch Post, the German Post. Some others, like the French one, like the Dutch one, decided to integrate insurance companies and bought an insurance company. We didn't start from scratch. It was not an agreement or a joint venture. It was a clear classical acquisition of a new pillar of their activity. So the relation between banks and insurance is quite complex. You have different cases which are interesting to have a look, and we'll use the Crédit Agricole case and the BNP Paribas case to give two different examples of this evolution. For banks trying to develop also low-cost banks, low-cost companies. The element of the analysis is low cost should be developed in all kinds of business. We have low-cost airlines, for example. We have low-cost banks. So low-cost bank, what is it? It is a complete digital bank with simple services. And in Europe, at least, most of the banks have decided to create with another brand, a bank which is a low-cost bank to catch some categories of customers. And we see that with BNP Paribas, for example. Or some of them also bought fintechs specialized in low-cost operations, and this is also the case of BNP Paribas. So you have different ways to have a low-cost offer, in fact, which is a simplified digital offer in general, or which is based on the distribution of a service on an existing network with marginal cost to pay. For example, BNP Paribas has bought what we call Nickel, you see that in the presentation, which is a simple service of financial service, which was developed, by a fintech with the tobacco shop, which is very surprising in the beginning, but it seems it works very well. Fifth point, cost reduction. When your return on equity decrease, become lower than your weighted average cost of capital, when you are submitted to more and more constraints, when the science market doesn't grow very quickly. You have two possibilities. The first one is to develop concentrations to obtain economies of scales. And the second one is what is mentioned here, is to reduce your cost, productivity, more productivity in your operation, cost reduction. So it is a priority. And this is accelerated by the decrease in interest rates. Because when, interest rates are very low, the margins for the banks are very low on many traditional financial operations, in some cases negative. You can say, for example, as an individual in France, but it is the same in all the European countries, I can obtain a 10-year loan from my bank to invest in real estate at less than 1% a year. That means if you think to what could be the margin of a bank, it's very, very low or even negative. That means in some operations like the real estate loans today, the business for banks is not to get direct return, but it is to keep the customer for a long-term period in order to be able to sell the customer other products or services with better margins. So anyway, that's much more difficult, than to have a 2%, 3% margin, on the classical financial loans, straight loans with limited level of risk, particularly on real estate. So that's a few management trends which explain also this acquisition and concentration. A few strategic rules, or a few strategic points, perhaps. The first one is that international strategies are often revisited. You will see. One of the answers to problems I explained here, one of the answers is to say, okay, we have to make productivities, okay? We have to develop agreements with fintechs and insurance companies, and we have also to acquire banks to enlarge our market share in the countries where we are and to develop activities in new markets in Europe. Well, what you see is that also international strategies are regularly revisited. You will see among the players we will analyze here. Some of them, BNP Paribas, for example, or even Crédit Agricole, or another one who will not study the case, which is Société Générale. They make arbitrage between the countries. For example, all of them, all the three, they still invest in Italy because they think the Italian market, has to be really concentrated. But if you compare the number of banks to the number of inhabitants in the country, it is the largest percentage in Europe. But also, and they invest also in Poland, which is the best market in the Central and Eastern Europe. But they disinvest the investment they have done in the 90s, when the market will open after the end of communism, in countries of the Southeast region. It means in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Serbia, for example, which are smaller markets, more risky markets also, and markets where they are not leaders. because you find other banks with more traditional position, like the Austrian banks, for example, or German banks there. So international strategies in terms of allocation, of the investments and the acquisitions are constantly, often revisited. This is not very different what we find in industry, non-financial activity. We find the same principle. Let's try to concentrate where we have a leadership or a large market, position number 2, perhaps number 3 on very large market, but don't stay on markets which are quite limited, risky, with a marginal position. So this is the first rule, and we find in international strategy, acquisitions, merger, the same rules that we find in industry. The second point is liquidity. And what we see today is that liquidity is more and more important. For years, let's say up to the beginning of the century, non-liquid bank at the point were generally, negotiating with their central bank or with governments to get some kind of equity issues, cash, loan, kind of development of a policy which will allow them to escape to bankruptcy. What we will see now is that on this market, the situation is different. And we have a very good example with ABN AMRO Bank and the member of the consortium. I said a few words on. One of them, at least, Fortis banks in Belgium, was bankrupt. Okay, the government, was there. Belgian government was there, but Belgian government didn't bring a direct financial loan or help. He was a partner in the negotiation to find another bank bringing the liquidity necessary to open the different branches the following day. It was not in the same position. It was not bringing cash. It was trying to find a solution to escape, to a kind of systemic crisis. You can bring other example very different, I mean, when you have one bank like Fortis or another one like in England, Royal Bank of Scotland, without liquidity, generally government trying to help to find a solution, but don't bring the solution. But when you have a general crisis, and the pandemic is a good example. With the pandemic, the risk was not a risk for one or two banks, it was a risk of systematic risk. That means that large part of the banks fell and their non-liquid banks were bankrupt. So in that case, governments are still there, bringing directly cash if it is necessary. But in fact, what we have seen, it is that in front of this systematic, there's global risk, let's put it that way. The most active policy was the policy of the central bank. So somehow the states are replaced by the central bank, and the lead is the lead of the central bank, even if the states one way or another participate to the project, of restructuration of the sector and of some banks. But don't remember this very clear principle, whatever happens and whatever the period is, A non-liquid bank is dead. So we have different solutions. We had different solutions 20 years ago and now. We have different players, governments, the European Union, central banks, but the rule is still the same. A bank needs liquidity. Third, a well-managed shareholder group is a strategic asset. We didn't spend much time on shareholders group. And this is not studied with sufficient, investment and time in textbook and in finance courses. But when you live, at the upper level, that's what I've been doing for years, in large industrial group or in banks, you understand that this is one of the key points. Who are your shareholders? How many shareholders? Individuals, investment funds, activists, insurance companies, banks, governments, regional funds. Is this shareholder group diversified? Do we have long-term shareholders? Are they ready to bring some more cash if it is necessary, either to develop acquisitions or to if the bank is confronted to a crisis? All of those questions, should be raised. And the relations with the shareholders is one of the key priority for CEOs, financial managers. And this is true, of course, in industry, in non-financial activities, but this is much more important, in the banking and insurance sector. As always, and I have nothing else to say here. Training and experience, apprenticeships are needed to succeed in M&A operation. This is what conditions we met with Danone Group, You will find them with BNP Paribas. One of the strengths, long-term strategic trends with BNP Paribas, you will see in the three operations I will describe, is that, they have a team dedicated to all these operations of acquisition, mergers, partnerships, joint ventures, splits, and so on. And they have been working for that during the last 25 years. They are very well trained. They know the rules. They know the good practice. They know what the warnings are. And this is not the case of all the banks. You will compare with one of the main competitors, which is Crédit Agricole, and you will see what the difference is in terms of results of the operation success and failures. Last point, just to underline, and we'll see again that last point in details, we forget the Crédit Agricole. It's about partial mergers. We said a few words at the beginning in session number 1 on partial mergers, with a few slides. But in the banking system, partial mergers are often used, and this is one of the elements to remind through the Crédit Agricole, Crédit Lyonnais case. You get two banks, Crédit Agricole and Crédit Lyonnais. We'll explain how Crédit Agricole acquired Crédit Lyonnais and how afterwards they merged. But at the time, Crédit Agricole obtained 100% of Crédit Lyonnais. One of the easiest way to do it, particularly, was to merge all the departments, subsidiaries of both banks and create only one bank. But it was a strategic decision. And it was said it's probably not the best policy. We are, if you simplify, on two very different markets. The first one is a retail banking. And the second one is what we can call non-retail, or all the investment and financial operations on capital markets. And the constraints, competition level, potential economies of scale, cost reductions policies are quite different. Also, the customers we have probably they don't react the same way. On the retail banking, you have many customers. They have been customers for years, or even their families are customers. Their parents and grandparents were customers, very kind of tradition there. And, they have a feeling that the bank, Crédit Agricole or Crédit Lyonnais, is part of the family. They are kind of owners of the banks, and very often, anyway, they get shares, of a bank. And if one day you decide that Crédit Lyonnais is not anymore Crédit Lyonnais, has just disappeared, and you are now not customers of Crédit Lyonnais, but of Crédit Agricole, and if you were customers of Crédit Lyonnais, which has been for years #1 bank in France, and you are acquired and merged into Crédit Agricole, the bank of the farmers, you don't want to stay there. You will move to another bank. Some of those customers, because they want to put the banks into competition, they get at the same time accounts in Crédit Agricole and in Crédit Lyonnais, and suddenly there's only one bank. They want to move at least one of your accounts. They will perhaps keep an account in the bank after the merger, but they will open another account in another bank, BNP Paribas, Crédit Agricole, Société Générale, or even another European bank. So the consequence is that the managers in charge of a retail bank after the acquisition decided that they had to keep two separate retail banks. They had to keep two different brands, Crédit Agricole on one side and Crédit Agricole on the other one. Of course, they decided, to merge in order to have economies of scale, some kind of operations, for example, in information systems. But all the elements, the presentations to the customer were exactly the same they were before the merger. The risk to lose customers and they escape at least partly and choose another bank was estimated to be so great that they decided, to keep as they were, at least for the, I would say, the front line. In the back, of course, we try to reduce costs and obtain economies of scale. On the contrary, for all the other activities, and particularly those on the markets, they decided to merge immediately and to make only one institution with one brand, with one team. Cost reduction and economies of scales were priorities and were obtained as soon as possible. So the banking sector is a sector where partial mergers, occur quite often. after acquisition, or a general merger. It means we have a general merger between two banks, and after that, it is decided that the merger itself will occur only on part of the activities, but on the other part, it will not be a merger, retail banks generally, at least the branches will be still quite independent, even the backyard, in order to reduce costs, partial merger in retail banks are done. So that's a few points I wanted to go through with you here, before moving further into the cases. So now I move from 32. I hope I will succeed in doing that. It's always difficult for me, to 33. And before moving further into the details, just a few points on what's happened here. And I will try also to explain why I choose these cases, because, I've got, many more cases available, but I thought I could give you some good illustration of what's happened in acquisition and merger in banking system in Europe. In fact, when you compare to the US, movement is quite similar, even if it was quicker in the US in the last 20 years than it has been in Europe. You find also a situation which is very different between the different parts of these large markets, even in the US, the concentration is much advanced. In some eastern state, northeast, Boston, New York, and in California. And in Europe, we find the same situation, it's much more advanced in countries like Britain or France than it is in a country like Italy or a country like Germany. Okay, so these large markets are still heterogeneous. So, as I said, I've chosen 4 cases. HSBC, with a strategy, a financial policy, a complete charge, and an operation, which has been an operation on a French bank, which is CCF being Crédit Commercial de France. And it was the first large acquisition, international acquisition in Europe about 20 years ago. And HSBC decided to resold this bank at the beginning of 2021. And it was done, I will explain how, a few months ago. Crédit Agricole and Crédit Lyonnais, that's just what I explained a few minutes ago, in fact, 2 very different banks, the Bank of the Farmers, the Bank of Industry. It seemed for years, that Crédit Lyonnais was really a bank, and Crédit Agricole was a kind of, I'm not say a bank, something like between the post office and a bank. And at the end of the process, Crédit Agricole bought Crédit Lyonnais. And you understand when you analyze this operation that Crédit Agricole is more stable. Activities are less volatile, more diversified. Crédit Lyonnais is on the international markets industry, and sometimes they are submitted to a crisis in some industrial sectors. So at the end, Crédit Lyonnais was bankrupt, was then nationalized and privatized, and Crédit Lyonnais Agricole had the opportunity to buy Crédit Lyonnais and decided to acquire Crédit Lyonnais and to make a partial merger, what just I explained. BNP Paribas, BNPP success story is probably the most interesting one. Now it's #1 bank in Europe. I will explain how it was done around mergers, and then 3 large acquisitions. The first one, BNP, which is mainly a retail bank at the time, acquiring Paribas, the second P, which was a bank of industry, having large stakes in several economic sectors. Second, the acquisition by BNPP of a bank in Italy, which is #5 now in Italy. And then the best opportunities probably they meet with the acquisition of Fortis in Belgium. I said a few words on a few minutes ago. And we see also some other investments in Poland. Why Poland? And we explain that. On fintechs, and also the stake of a market they have in California, where they're #6 in California, and trying to resell with great success, and after nearly 25 years of profitability, their subsidiaries there. And last, the ABN AMRO crash. ABN AMRO, resulting from a merger of 2 Dutch banks, was signing an agreement with Barclays, a friendly agreement, and a consortium of banks, just what I explained, at the beginning of the session, was made by 3 banks, #2 in Britain, Royal Bank of Scotland, #1 in Spain and Latin America, Santander, and #1 in Belgium, Fortis Bank. And at the end of the process, they succeeded, but were not able to finance the operation. And 2 of the 3 partners of the consortium, failed. No liquidity. Fortis was saved by BNP Paribas with the agreement of the Belgian government, and Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, was in fact nearly nationalized by the British government, which still have a stake of about 30% in the total equity of the bank. Santander, on the other side, now is #2 in Europe after BNP Paribas. And why? Because they were more diversified geographically. 50% of their activities, operations were in Europe, 50% in Latin America. And second, because of the quality and long-term strategy and vision of their shareholders. They were mainly insurance company, and they bought the cash necessary to survive and to start again with acquisition in a good period. Prices of banks and insurance companies were low, to enlarge the market share. So this is what I've chosen. Third slide here. Just a kind of, first summary of what is the situation of banks in Europe. The point here, history, it's always of interest to understand what's happened now, to go back to history. Probably partly in Europe. 19th century, in the first years of the 20th century, was a free trade period. Everyone has forgotten that. Before the First World War, 1914, that's a century ago, the world was more open than it was before 1914 and 2000. So that means we have many banks, with networks, subsidiaries, joint ventures on other continents. So they were quite often international banks. But they were owned by families mainly. Sometimes we were listed also, but the stake of shares available in the market was very limited. It was marginal. So family-owned, international, that was the situation. From the beginning of the First World War, 1914, up to the Common Market Treaty signature in 1957, remember always that when we to Europe, this is a period of protectionism, wars, reconstruction, to world wars, you know, and the 10 years after, 12 years after the Second World War, banks are more and more under state control. Most of the banks were nationalized, state-owned. And you will see that, for example, most of the banks merged into BNP Paribas were nationalized in 1945. You will also understand that CCF, the target of HSBC in France, which was very profitable, was nationalized and then privatized. State was managing the banking system. First, the last 40 years of the 20th century, banks became more independent players. Privatization started. The first one in France, for example, started in 1986. In Italy, a few years after. In Germany, it was done progressively since the beginning of the 80s. The only country with no policy of nationalization was Britain. But that doesn't mean there was no nationalization or quasi nationalization in terms of period of crisis. The Bank of Scotland in 2008. So the market is more competitive than it was. It's not ruled by the state as it was. There's a kind of common ruling, but it is softer by the EU, by the ECB, and by also the governments. And in the back, you have also the Basel authorities, but which are not only with impacts in Europe, but all over the world. You heard about Basel II or Basel III, of course. Point 4, since the Euro and the Eurozone agreements, banks are designing their own strategy. It means with the creation of the Euro at the beginning of the century, 1999 for the banks, 2002 for all the citizens, the system is completely different. And each bank can now design in its strategy. Now, many banks were very specialized. We had in many countries, European countries, a bank to finance export, a bank to finance buildings, a banks to finance roads, a banks to finance agriculture, and so on. Okay, and you decide one day that all these banks, can stay specialized, but can develop their own strategy, can become diversified, can also merge with other banks without the agreement of the state. So very quickly, the battlefield moved, and we had concentrations. But we started with, a European situation with many banks. Nearly all of them were national banks, either completely owned by the state, or if they were not completely, partially owned, at least controlled by the state, and very often with very limited international experience. And we are moving to some kind of unified banking market, at least at the level of the Eurozone, and probably later at the level of the European Union, which means, more diversification, geographical, product, services, which means concentration, larger banks, bigger in terms of value, in terms of portfolio of activities, and so on. So the structure of the banking sector is moving very quickly. Last slide here. Of course, concentration, whatever they are, acquisition, mergers, joint ventures, agreements, whatever you want. And very often, the same one bank use these different ways to become larger. You have pros and cons. The first one is that large non-financial companies are more and more global, and they ask for services from their banks, in the different countries where they are located, and they ask for different expertise in terms of products and services, which are available only in diversified banks. So large non-financial companies, diversified companies, in terms of geography, in most of the cases, they ask for large banks, very diversified in terms of location and in terms of field of expertise. So if you want to meet your customers, you have to follow your customer in terms of strategy and structure. B, returns for the traditional banking activities are decreasing. That is what we know. But it's not something new. I remember when I was, working as a consultant for banks, retail banks, at the point in time, and it was second part of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. Their problem that was already the retail bank activities return was decreasing. It is something like 30 years ago. And the goal was to extend the percentage of our activities in out of the loan policies for retail banking and in other activities out of retail banking. So that means that the traditional model banks, has lower and lower returns, and this has been accelerated, by the low interest rates. And it's not surprising, you enter in Europe a branch of a bank, and they sell not only financial products, but they sell mobile phones, for example, which is very surprising, But it is part of their activity. They know that each customer is interested by having one or several mobile phones and improvements of their the quality of the communication. So they are more and more and that kind of business, which has nothing to do with the classical banking retail banks. So that means when branches survive, very often they do something else than the traditional bank. Of course, insurance, but they sell other products. We can sell you flights and hotels for your next trip in Phuket or in another island, and they can sell you also new mobile, if you need it. Third, of course, you have a competition of the new players. In particular, the moment, fintech companies. This is probably an opportunity, but this is a risk also. So this is one way is to concentrate and to negotiate agreements or to buy with these larger size fintech companies. against, for in cars now, cars. Of course, when you have large banks, a limited number of large banks, you increase systemic risk. And if you increase systemic risk, it means that you have to organize at the level of the continent, a better system of control, to improve rules. You have to make empirical research to understand what's happened with the Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, in order to design the Basel IV and perhaps one day a Basel V. So systemic risk become very essential, and we have to be prepared to that, to escape to such a crisis. Second, banks become too big to fail. Just because you want a bank like BNP Paribas or Santander, had no liquidity, probably, the system as a whole will be hurt. That means we are not even sure that it could be said by the European Central Bank and governments. So we know that anyway. At the time, the first difficulties occur, probably, the institution in charge of the financial system and the governments will develop a policy. So that means that bankruptcy, which is the normal situation for a firm which is not very well managed, cannot occur. See, we still have sovereignty constraints, and this is coming back in Europe at the moment, it came back suddenly with the pandemic crisis, saying, we cannot have, we have problems with products or raw materials, we don't find them because transportation system doesn't work properly. Some factories are closed in Asia because of the pandemic, so we don't have the parts which are useful for car production and so on. So it started mainly with industry, but now it is also extended to all kinds of operations and activities. And there's some kind of idea that national sovereignty of bank is not so bad, and not even if we largest part of the population is still in favor of Europe, and they put restrictions, on questions like sovereignty on the banks. So we are in that kind of situation. Perhaps the last point, see sovereignty will move again when the economic situation will be stable and more stable, and the pandemic will be over. But we are not still there, and we don't know what will happen anymore. So that's the present situation. Okay, so I just wanted to present you all these elements before going further. After the end of what I wanted to underline in the preceding case, Perrier case, I tried to introduce with two presentations, 32 and 33 here on the environment and the 4 cases, the cases themselves. For the next part will be on the, if I find it, where is it? Yes, it is here somewhere. Where is it? I want to find the HSBC case, and this is of course the one I don't find. So let's have a 5 minutes break. Right, it's time for the break. I'm a bit late again. And we start with HSBC. We start with HSBC. Okay. 5 minutes. That's it. Oh, ça doit aller.
C'était avec eux. C'était toute seule, non, maintenant. Hein? J'ai eu Victor avec toi. J'ai eu Victor. J'ai sorti mon dossier avec le poil. Je peux faire quelque chose. Hein? Une tisane, un chocolat, on prend regarde là. Elle adore se cacher là. Je vais la quitter pour qu'elle puisse regarder, elle adore. Moi, je pense que tu sais.
Oui. 3h, 6, 7.
Il y a un petit peu de neige.
C'est ça.
Ouais. Les Florence m'a dit qu'en fait, la fiesta fonctionnait, mais que la mise en route avait été faite par un conduit. Dans la vie, c'était un peu dur, mais il y avait à l'initiative du ministère, c'est encore plus beau. C'est tout, à l'occasion. Le gestionnaire a développé et la permettre
Il fait vraiment froid ici. Okay. So I hope you see a new case, on HSBC. Let's call it HSBC. In fact, it is HSBC in Europe through the last 20th century, and the long period, it's not as long as what we studied with Danone. The 20 years is quite long in a way, but it is of interest because you have two different strategies and different consequences in terms of M&A, financial operations. That's the interesting case. So this is an operation I've been working on, and I clearly asked to some of my students, I've got a course on that in Europe, and they have been using my slides, and they improved the slide, brought another view and some of the data and a better presentation. You will understand if you have some knowledge of the names of the students that this is a very international group anyway, because you have 4 students. You see the names in the upper part. It's very, very recent. We gave me that presentation very recently, 2 months ago. And the first students, Clarissa, is from Italy. Abrin is from India. Carlo is also Italian, and Tristan is French. So it's a very international look on this operation. So what we have here, just to summarize the case, we have a view of the banking industry at the beginning of the deal, in 2000. The deal itself, the integration of the bank, both CCF into HSBC, the post-deal consequences, and you will see the success of the operation, the increase with economies of scale, with more productivity, with cost reduction, with the share of expertise of the two players. Very positive situation, but you will understand also that after 2010, the financial situation declined, but HSBC was not able to go further into its acquisition. At the beginning, CCF was supposed to be the first of group of acquisition in different European countries in order to be one of the main players on all the bank operations in Western Europe. And when I say Western Europe, it's a continent, and Britain is another world. And progressively, the profitability went down, and they started 3-4 years ago to have 0 and then negative results, losing money, negative cash flows, and at the end, 2021, the end of the process was a new strategy developed and designed and developed at the level of HSBC worldwide, with concentration in Asia, reduction of inactivities, first in Europe, with resale of all the banking, retail banking activities, even in Britain, when they start to do that, and they will do the same in the US. So that means that the strategy was supposed to be the best one 20 years ago. Now it's completely changed, completely modified, and of course, in terms of M&A, this has several consequences. You have to bank here. We start at the beginning, and a strategy which is very clear here of HSBC. It's to develop its activities in continental Europe. 2000. Remember what I presented, in the slide before. 2000. That's the beginning of the unified financial and banking strategy in Europe, from the European governments, from the EU, with the creation also of the European Central Bank and of the Euro. So that means if you wanted to exist, in Europe, you have to be a member of the EU as a bank. It means you have to be clearly identified as a European bank. You have to develop network. You have to find customers. You have to develop activities. And the problem of HSBC, that of course HSBC was in England for years, large bank in London, but the problem was the position of the British. They were a member of the EU, but they were not a member of the financial banking activities. They were not a member of the Euro system, of the Eurozone, and they still kept their own currency with specific management made by the Central Bank of England. So for a bank, this is a difficult situation to manage, and they had to decide if they wanted to be clearly European or they wanted to keep just marginal activities in Europe. And they decided to invest in continental Europe. And to do that, they decided to have a policy of acquisition in Europe. But in fact, we will see that in spite of a few very, very marginal operations in countries like Poland and Italy, the only important investment they went through, they made the important acquisition, is the acquisition of CCF in France. So CCF, and it is written on the right side here, means Crédit Commercial de France. Perhaps difficult to pronounce for you, Crédit Commercial de France. And you have here a few elements of both banks in this operation. Both of these banks are, I would say, old banks. HSBC was created in 1865, and CCF, a bit younger, created in the middle of the First World War in 1917. And if you have a look, to the reasons of their creation, HSBC was created mainly to help finance trade between Asia and Europe. At the beginning, it was mainly the opium market, And on the other side, basic history of CCF, Crédit Commercial de France, was resulting of merging operations, making economies of scale on operations between France and Switzerland. And if you have a look to this history on the right side, CCF resulted from a merger, not a creation of scratch like HSBC, between different banks. Two of them were French bank, as the Crédit de Nice and Maison Aymar & Fils, and another one, Banque Suisse et Française, was a Swiss-based bank. Below, you find a few data on both banks. few data, and of course you understand that the sites are quite different. It's not an operation or a merger between equals. It's really a very large worldwide player trying to acquire a local bank. Have a look to the number of employees. 145,000 on one side, 6,300 on the other side. If you have a look to the asset side, it's about the same. If you have a look at the number of branches, the national countries, it's about 9 or 10 times bigger for the acquirer than for the target. Okay. You have a look also to the main activities, and of course, HSBC is more generalist than CCF, even expertise in the operations they have developed. You have here the presentation of the SWOT analysis, of HSBC. HSBC, it's a bank, as you know, which is strong in Asia and the UK region. They have done a large number of acquisitions. They are known for having good management. Perhaps among the weaknesses, it was not clear their position in Europe. They have high costs due to integrations were not very successful in many cases. So they did not reduce now the cost, and economy of scale is not at the level which was expected. They develop a pan-EU approach, and this is the explanation. They are quite advanced in technology among the competitors. At the same time, we have difficulties. They will have difficulties to enter the market because, in spite of the progressive unification, we still had different regulations, and we still have different regulations. Even the situation is better right now than 20 years ago. They have strength assets like wealth management, and they were advanced compared to most of the players in continental Europe on internet and e-commerce. That was clear. So after that, you will find on these slides, elements on the level of the banks by total assets, give you some idea of relative size. Then you have to be very careful with a bank balance sheet. Now, what really happened, if you want to understand that, you have also to understand before a situation of CCF, and at least, and this is again a point which is central, the shareholder group structure of CCF. And it is written here at the bottom of the slide. CCF was listed on the stock market. It was in France, probably number 6. It depends how we make the accounts. But it is not large and larger banks. It's not the size of BNP, of Crédit Agricole, Société Générale. But in fact, if you have a look to the profitability, it was at the time the most profitable bank in the country. So you are not the biggest one, but you are somewhere between the higher part of the medium-sized banks, and you are the more profitable. And you have a shareholder group which is made of international players. ING, which is well known and still living, with 19% stake, is a Dutch bank. Swiss Life is a Swiss insurance company, as you can understand. And KBC is a Flemish, it means Belgian Flemish bank. It's number one in the Flemish part of Belgium. And all these banks together, if you have a look to the total, it's 33% combined from KBC and Swiss Life. That's an agreement together. ING 19% stake, So it seemed that if all these players agreed together, there was no room for HSBC. Okay. So you see the period of time here. It took about 6 months. First, on September 1999, Swiss Life raises his stake. They bought a stake of another player, and they've increased because we had the system of double rights of votes on some shares. They've increased their level of voting rights. In November, progressively, October and November, we had rumors of acquisition with a higher volume on the market. And progressively, ING bought shares. It was decided in December, so it means it started in fact September 5th, December 12th, about 3 months later. ING decided to launch a takeover bid, but this takeover bid was not accepted by the stock market authorities because they wanted to pay. They wanted to pay in shares, but they didn't have the shares to pay. It means if you want to pay in shares, you have to prove that you have the shares. You are not anymore in the world of the 60s of the past century with Saint-Gobain, and they didn't have a share to pay. So they had to withdraw very quickly because of the reaction of the market authorities their offer. And in April, there was another offer coming from HSBC that time, and the price offered was increased, and HSBC wanted to acquire not a stake, but wanted to acquire 100% of the shares. So summary is at the beginning, it seems there was no room for an acquisition. Second, one of the partners of the shareholders, ING, tried to increase in share and to take the control, starting from less than 20%. They were not able to pay in cash. They wanted to pay in shares, but in fact, they did not have a share and wanted to issue the share afterwards. This was not accepted by the stock market management and regulators. And in fact, in front of this situation, HSBC was able to come and to make a bid on 100% of the shares. That's what's you understand. It will take from September to April, which is more than 6 months. So you have motivation of both players because you will understand that it is also it is a friendly offer. ING offer was an offer of one of the shareholders of the bank, but it was not accepted by the board. It means even if it is coming from one of the shareholder, it's a hostile offer. It's not a friendly offer. And on the contrary, HSBC coming from outside, we didn't have any share at the beginning, you know, could be considered as an answer to the non-stable situation of the equity structure, and they were welcome by the board of directors and other shareholders. So you find the motivation of synergies here, you know, for the deal, for HSBC access to the European markets and a good image on the market, because CCF was the most profitable bank and probably the best image on the French market at the time. They will have a listing on the Paris Stock Exchange of the HSBC share. This was at the same time, you know, something which was nearly compulsory if you want to develop for HSBC, if you wanted to develop its shareholder group on the Eurozone market, in particular in France. Yeah, and this was also part of the agreement with the French authorities. French authorities didn't want to lose one of the best listing of banks on the market. They will get high worth customers. This is one of the specificities of that bank. Customers which were wealthy compared to the average customers of the other bank. And they had a strong and well-located network of branches, you know, among the regions we find healthy customers, at the same time individuals, but also firms. Cost reduction were expected and and there is a growth potential of this group, taking into account the capacity of the bank, which is HSBC Bank, to invest in other potential operations in the Eurozone. For CCF, it was potential access to HSBC network worldwide and expertise, particularly in Asia. At the time, you know, Asia was really a goal for all the European financial players. They avoided that way the hostile takeover by ING. There was value creation for shareholders. They thought, or they understood at least, there was no impact on bank independence because the bank will, the French bank will stay quite independent with an independent board, with system of decision which give them, you know, great independence from the British structure. It seems also that it was well accepted by the staff because of the image of HSBC, and because also it was forecasted an increase in the number of staff workforce without any layoffs, because of the development of new segments of activities of the bank in France and in other European countries. So it seems that if you have a look to all the elements, it's very positive in terms of development for both banks. So what you see here is a few data, a few elements on the operation itself. You know, first, you know, it is presented, in fact, as a friendly offer. HSBC has appeared as a white knight. You know, ING had a stake of at the end 19% of the shares. but it was not accepted by KBC, it was not accepted by Swiss Life as being the managing structure, as being the majority shareholder. Which means, that the defense of CCF and the strategy to invest and to develop its activity from HSBC in Europe met at the same time. So HSBC accepted, to pay with a premium. They pay for a premium. They had, in fact, at the end, about 25% premium on the last prices before the beginning of the deal, and the price of CCF shares has already increased in the preceding month. Something which is quite interesting, you see it on the right side, is how it was paid. And this is very unusual. It was paid in shares at more than 90%, 93 precisely, 7% only in cash. It means in that kind of offer, and we see that again in our cases with banks, but also with pharmaceutical sector, the acquire, they often leave a choice for the payments between 2 or 3 potential solutions. And here there was a choice between being paid in shares and being paid in cash for the shareholder of CCF. And 93% of them decided to be paid in shares. That means, in that kind, but what does it mean? It means probably when you make the calculation, at the end of the period of the offer, the price paid in shares is higher than the price paid in cash, which is the case. But also it means that these prices are different. It's because many shareholders and outsiders also coming in believe that the project will be successful, and it is much better to be in the project than to take cash and to try to reinvest the cash in any kind of other kind of project. So the fact that you get more than 90% of shareholders of Target choosing to get shares instead of cash is a good signal of the quality of the project which is proposed. How was it funded? It's not really of interest. I think even we put that here because the deal is a small deal for HSBC because of the different insight. You find the different percentages here between the resources of the bank, the loan coming from outside, shares, and Tier 1 securities. Okay. So again, you find some data, but you already saw that. What we can say is that in terms of profitability, both banks are very similar at the time of the deal. They are 15, 17%, which are, in the target of the profitable bank in the countries, and particularly in continental Europe and in England also at the time. Then you understood that HSBC is much bigger than CCF. It depends how we measure that. It's from 8 to 12 as a multiplier if you compare the assets or if you compare the EBIT. Okay, you will find more here, more details on the timeline. We already went through the first steps, 1997, 1998 to 2000, friendly offer from CCF, April the 3rd. A few months after, it takes about 7 weeks for the offer itself and few weeks before for authorizations. So in July, by the end of July, HSBC, and this shows also the quality of the offer, owned 98.6% of total shareholder shares. Only 1.4% of the shares were not bought during the operation. And it was a second operation, which is a squeeze out, and which allowed HSBC to make a compulsory offer on the same basis of payments to the last shareholders of CCF. And by the end of 2000, the CCF share was delisted from the market, and HSBC share was listed on the Paris stock market. 5 years later, in 2005, was another element coming in, which is the change in the name. Progressively, and this is a good example. The new bank was very profitable, in fact, was very successful, but they decided to integrate it more. Well, I have independent board in Paris. 2 members of the board of CCF became members of HSBC board in London. But at the same time, they wanted to use the same name, the same brand all over the countries. And first, they used CCF with small letters below HSBC. 2 years later, HSBC in big letters and CCF in small letters. And 5 years later, CCF disappeared and CCF became HSBC France. It's not sure it was a good decision because, as what I explained, all banks, traditional customers, and they think that CCF somehow is part of a family, and even if you keep the same branches, even the same director in each branch, they don't accept that you modify the name, So you have some comparables in terms of valuation if you are interested in that kind of problem also, and price to book value, market to book value, and it was clearly well valued. Few more elements here. Post-deal effect. So progressively, it was an integration anyway. So HSBC wanted first to extend its strategy of acquisition, and HSBC used first CCF name and logo to buy banks in the country. And I have a few names of family-owned bank, Banque Hervé, Banque Worms, Banque Pelletier. They tried to ensure the French management, French culture. They kept the names, and they bought 11 banks and have 11 branches in the country. But anyway, a few years after what I said, they decided to eliminate all these brands and to recenter all the brands in one, which is HSBC Paris. They chose HSBC France first, and then they chose HSBC Paris, which was not very well accepted in the countryside. When you are 500 kilometers from Paris, you don't want to have a bank with a name. HSBC is from nowhere, if you are there, and HSBC Paris. And if you had to choose, of course, HSBC France was better than HSBC Paris. It wasn't good communication. So they started losing customers. All customers didn't want that. They wanted to have the banks, and most of them moved to Société Générale. So on the right side, you have a small graph which shows you the progressive integration of the policy of CCF into the policy of the HSBC, with integration of HSBC rules in the management of CCF. Even if most of CCF top manager remained, in their position. But anyway, all the principles, all the constraints of the management, particularly in terms of risk management, became those on HSBC. So if you have a look on stock markets, you will see that at the beginning it was a success, that of course we had the first crisis, remember that, it is in blue here, when the bubble, in what we call the Carmel internet bubble, bursts, and the prices of the banks, the value of the banks went down and started again, after the crisis with very high returns. And this is what you see in 2004 and 2005. So you had the first step, which is very successful. You follow the market, but then after that, it's very profitable again. So that means, after 5 years, it was a success. But then, you will have other steps, and the maximum will be in 2007, of course. So it can be explained through main financial indicators here. Want to go further. So what's happened progressively, and this is much more interesting, perhaps. Acquisition of CCF in 2000. So it was a friendly one. HSBC appeared as white knight, great opportunity to appear as white knight, but anyway, they did not understand how to use this good image. The brand policy was not good at all, probably, and they were more and more analyzed. This bank were more analyzed as a British bank, making acquisitions on the European market. Anyway, we had a period of expansion in spite of this bubble in 2001 and 2002. But starting in 2007, we had a crisis. And we had in 2008 the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers. Everybody knows about that. And in 2011, they started moving to a more, I would say, limited strategy. And that started, in fact, with disinvestment in credit card, particularly in the US. And then the left from some countries, which was very surprising at the time, because, these countries were with high potential, even if the political stability is not was very clear. I put the name of Turkey and Brazil, my students, here. This is quite surprising. It means when you leave Turkey, it means in fact you leave the Middle East. When you leave Brazil, you leave South America. And then 2021, they decided, to reduce their activities in retail banking, first to leave continental Europe, and in fact it was mainly France, the Eurozone, and then to leave retail banking in the US. So you have a long-term strategic movement with really two steps. Yeah, the first one with investment and expansion from 2000 and 2007, and the main investment is this investment in France. And the second one is a restructuring period starting, beginning of 10 years ago, I would say, and progressively they left from some kind of segments of the banking sector activities and also from some countries. This was reflected in. So you can explain that with elements we have already identified and explained. Fintech, interest rate, Basel III, leading to more competition, concurrence, decrease in margins, increase also in cost of financing, problems of margin when you compare the cost of resources and the weighted average cost of capital. So they decided, to resell. And the problem was really to resell, which is explained through copies of articles here. Just to summarize what it means. CCF, or HSBC France, became 5 years ago non-profitable. And year after year, the accounts showed losses. So that means the most profitable bank at the beginning of the century was now a source of losses for HSBC Group. It means, behind there is clearly a question of strategic choices and management. It was of the best segments in terms of customers in the country. They have good expertise on some segments, but they have been unable, to capitalize on this strength and to extend this experience to other European countries. But if we started to have negotiation with some of the banks in order to sell with HSBC France, and we started first with Société Générale. Société Générale, as remember, so some of the customers of CCF left CCF after the modification of the brand and the name from CCF to HSBC. A large majority of them moved to Société Générale. So Société Générale was still interested in spite of the situation, financial situation was not as good as it was 15 years before, still interested by CCF. But they could not agree on the price. If we could not agree on that. They had also a negotiation with another bank which was willing to develop its activities, into more sophisticated banking, which is the Post Office Bank. But even the Post Office Bank was probably ready to pay a good price, they failed. So after a few months of negotiation, they understood that it was impossible to find a buyer for a positive price. So they had two solutions: either to keep HSBC France and to try to restructure, to manage the bank, to bring back positive net earnings, or they had to negotiate. But if they had to negotiate, it would be probably to sell for €1, but after investing money for restructuration into the bank. And they started, to they started to negotiate with investment funds. And one of them was in several negotiations, one of them called Cerberus, made a proposal. We are ready to buy HSBC France as it is right now, okay? But it is for €1, and you have to put, to invest cash for 3 billion, about 3 billion euros before you sign the contract. It's clearly, it is clearly, a situation which was met also by other banks. ING, you remember ING? Huh? It was one of the shareholders of CCF 20 years ago, and they wanted to buy CCF, and they made an offer which wasn't accepted by market authorities and by the other shareholders. But there are also in France, when they are Dutch, but they get now also losses for the last 3 years with ING France, and they want to live. And they tried also to negotiate with potential buyers of the banks, and even with funds, but they didn't want to reinvest into the bank. They were ready to sell for €1, but they don't want to have a negative value, in fact. So at the end, they have decided to negotiate with investment funds in order to sell them only the portfolio of customer. And this is interesting in terms of disinvestment. Okay, no one wants to pay for my bank, okay? I keep my bank, but I sell only the portfolio of customer. That means I keep the information system, I keep buildings, the accounting, and so on, but I leave a portfolio. So I want cash from my portfolio, and after that, this is my job to restructure all what is left in the bank. So that's what we have decided to do, and we have decided to resell also, to an investment fund. So that's, in fact, the end of a story here. This is the end of a story. And the question is what Cerberus, the new shareholder, will do with this bank, and what about HSBC's strategy? So Cerberus seems to be an investment fund looking for opportunities, to buy banks, limited size, but with the potential, with after restructuration and with a better management, perhaps, in order to merge all of them together. They want to create, in fact, a new bank. And perhaps after restructuring several acquisitions and after merging these acquisitions together to make either an IPO on this new bank or to resell this new profitable merged bank, to another bank like BNP Paribas, Société Générale, and Crédit Agricole. So you have really several steps. The shareholder HSBC, they want to leave France and continental Europe. They want to sell. At the end, after negotiating with banks, we find only a potential buyer, which is an investment fund. $1, €1, but they had to invest $3 billion US before leaving. Okay. Cerberus now is an investment fund looking for opportunities to buy banks with difficult situation, which are possible to restructure, to merge together, reducing the cost, making economies of scale. And after a few years, 4, 5, 6, perhaps, and with better circumstances, like, for example, higher interest rate, either an opportunity to make an IPO on the stock market or opportunities to resell this new bank made of a merger of these several acquisitions, to resell them to a large bank. This is a project, you know. So, are we living the last breath of retail banking? I don't know. This is a question you can raise. And perhaps there is a new birth for retail banks in the next few years, because constraints will not be tighter, and market conditions and interest rates will be more in favor of the banks, you know, and we will be also partly restructured and more adapted to the new competitive environment. So I wanted to present you this case because it was the first real large acquisition of a bank which is quite well known and profitable by a non-continental bank. This bank, HSBC, has a clear strategy to be in the Eurozone, developing banking activities, at least in the larger countries. The largest countries are Germany and France, of course. And they were successful. They came with a very adapted, well accurate policy, being the white knight in front of ING, which had a poor strategy at the time. They were successful in paying shares, as Danone did, remember? We can explain that and why they did that and why the CCM shareholders accepted. They were first, you know, they had a very adapted strategy of integration, keeping the staff, increasing the number of staff, developing new segments of activities and so on. But after a few years, they decided to move from CCF to the HSBC brand, which was a wrong decision in Europe and particularly in France. And the last about 20% of the customer, mainly to Société Générale. They were, let's say, profitable, did better performance than the market up to the 2008 crisis. But after that, progressively, and mainly after 2010, they started with regular reduction of their profitability, okay? And they became, you know, non-profitable or nearly bankrupt bank in the last 3 years. So we decided to move from a strategy of expansion. They reduced the number of countries. They sold in Brazil, they sold in Turkey, and progressively we thought that it was necessary, at least in Europe and in America, to leave the business, retail banking business, the US and France, and they decided to resell. And it was very difficult to resell. And at the end, after several months of negotiation with traditional banks, they sold for €1, but with an investment of $3 billion to an investment fund, Cerberus. And Cerberus is one of the new players of the banking market, buying banks which were profitable in the past, but probably with a wrong strategy, bad management, and they tried to buy them for nothing, to restructure them, to merge them, and with a goal one day to resell them either to a traditional profitable bank or with an IPO on the stock market. So that's what I wanted to show you, and I know that some of you know very well HSBC, and this is a good, I think you have a better understanding what is the strategy of HSBC worldwide and what's happened also in Western Europe, and it's a good example of an inversion of a strategy in about 20 years with different M&A operations. So that's all for today. We have been through the end of the Perrier case with the presentation 32 and 33 on the banking system, and on one case, HSBC, CCF, which is a good example of what can happen, on the banking system in terms of M&A operation. So we will move now tomorrow to other banks and 3 more cases. Remember, we will study the BNP Paribas case, we'll study the Crédit Agricole, Crédit Lyonnais, we study ABN AMRO, Santander, RBS, and Fortis case, trying to find some conclusions, and then move to another topic. So thank you very much. Have a good night, sleep well, and we meet tomorrow again, same time as usual. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, Professor.
Goodbye, Professor.
Bye, Tram.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you to be there so late.